The smell of death filled the air as winter tightened its grip on the Norse settlement. But inside the great hall, families gathered around tables loaded with meat that should have rotted months ago. This was the Vikings' secret that changed history, and it wasn't what you think. In the frozen lands of 9th century Scandinavia, one mistake meant everyone died. Not from battle or disease, but from something far more common: hunger. When the first snows fell and the last harvest was stored away, Viking families faced a terrifying countdown. The meat from their autumn slaughter had to last until spring returned. If it spoiled, there would be no second chance. But the Vikings had discovered something that modern people have forgotten. They had learned to cheat death itself by cheating time. Picture this: a Norse family of 20 people huddled in their longhouse as winter storms rage outside. The wind howls through the walls, and snow piles higher than a man's head. There are no stores to visit, no neighbors to borrow from. The nearest settlement is days away through deadly cold. In their storage rooms hang the preserved remains of cattle, pigs, and sheep slaughtered months before. This meat will determine who lives and who dies before the snow melts. The stakes couldn't be higher. Archaeological evidence from Viking sites across Norway shows the harsh reality of these winters. Excavations at Borg reveal longhouses that sheltered entire extended families, sometimes 30 or more people, through the darkest months. The pressure on food supplies was enormous. One family's failure to preserve enough meat could doom them all. This wasn't just about personal survival. It was about the survival of Viking culture itself. Without mastering food preservation, the Vikings could never have become the explorers and traders who would reshape medieval Europe. No preserved food meant no long sea voyages. No sea voyages meant no raids on English monasteries, no settlements in Iceland, no discovery of America 500 years before Columbus. The ancient sagas hint at the desperate measures people took when preservation failed. The Grettir saga tells of winters so harsh that men ate the bark of trees and many starved. Other sources describe families forced to slaughter their breeding animals just to survive, a decision that meant poverty for generations. But most Vikings didn't face this fate. They had developed techniques so effective that archaeologists still find perfectly preserved organic materials in their storage sites. These weren't lucky accidents. They were the result of centuries of accumulated knowledge, passed down from parent to child like sacred wisdom. The key lay in understanding their environment in ways we can barely imagine today. Vikings didn't fight against the harsh climate of Northern Europe. They learned to use it. The cold that could kill them in hours became their greatest tool for preserving life. The salt spray from violent North Sea storms became a precious commodity. Even the smoke from their fires served a purpose beyond warmth. At Hedeby, once the largest Viking trading center, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of industrial-scale food preservation. Massive pits filled with layers of salt. Underground chambers designed to control temperature and airflow. Specialized tools for butchering and processing that show remarkable sophistication. This wasn't primitive survival. It was advanced technology adapted to their world. The social implications were enormous. Families that mastered preservation techniques gained power and influence. They could feed more people, support larger households, and take greater risks. They could send their sons on long trading expeditions or raids, knowing the family would survive their absence. They could welcome guests and allies, building the complex networks that held Viking society together. Knowledge of preservation also created its own form of currency. The wise women, who understood the deepest secrets of meat curing, held positions of tremendous respect. Their skills could mean the difference between a thriving community and a dead one. Some preservation techniques were guarded as closely as military secrets, passed down only within certain families or clans. This created tensions that would echo through Viking history. Competition for the best preservation knowledge sparked feuds between families. Access to key resources like salt or specific types of wood became sources of conflict. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, these traditional practices would clash with new religious beliefs, creating internal struggles that helped end the Viking Age. But all of this was still in the future. In those early winter nights, as families gathered around their hearths, the immediate challenge was simpler and more urgent, making their preserved meat last until spring. The techniques they had developed weren't just clever tricks. They were the foundation of everything the Vikings would become. The meat hanging in their smokehouses represented months of careful planning and precise execution. Every step in the preservation process had been refined over generations. The timing of the slaughter, the selection of animals, the preparation of salt, the gathering of the right wood for smoking, all of it had to be perfect. One mistake could ruin weeks of work and doom a family to starvation. Yet somehow, in the face of these impossible odds, the Vikings had not just survived, they had thrived. They had turned one of the world's harshest environments into the launching pad for an age of exploration and conquest that would reshape the medieval world. And it all began with their ability to make meat last through the winter. The answer lay buried in the earth itself, waiting for modern archaeologists to uncover secrets that had been hidden for 1,000 years. What they found would rewrite everything we thought we knew about Viking innovation. In 1963, Danish archaeologists working at the fortress of Trelleborg made a discovery that stunned the academic world. Beneath the remains of Viking longhouses, they found something unexpected: sophisticated underground chambers, precisely engineered to control temperature and airflow. These weren't crude storage pits. They were advanced preservation systems that rivaled anything built before the Industrial Age. The chambers revealed the first great Viking preservation secret: salt. But not just any salt, and not used in ways we might expect. The Vikings had discovered that different types of salt worked better for different purposes. Sea salt, laboriously collected from coastal evaporation ponds, was perfect for fish. Rock salt, traded from distant lands at enormous expense, worked best for large cuts of meat. Each type required different techniques, different timing, different amounts. The process began with the slaughter itself. Viking butchers, and archaeological evidence shows they were skilled professionals, knew exactly when and how to kill their animals for maximum preservation potential. They understood that stressed animals produced meat that spoiled faster. They knew which cuts would preserve best and which needed to be eaten immediately. The salting process was an art form. Too little salt, and rot would set in. Too much, and the meat became inedible. The salt had to be worked into every surface, every crevice, with a thoroughness that took hours for a single animal. Archaeological finds show specialized tools designed just for this purpose. Bone instruments worn smooth by countless hands, metal implements that could cut and spread salt simultaneously. But salt alone wasn't enough. The Vikings had discovered that certain combinations of salt and other substances created preservation effects that lasted far longer than either ingredient alone. They mixed salt with juniper berries, whose natural oils fought bacterial growth. They added specific types of ash that changed the chemical environment around the meat. Some mixtures included herbs that we now know have antimicrobial properties. The second great secret was smoke, but again, not used in ways we might expect. Different woods produced different types of smoke with different preservation qualities. Oak smoke created a deep penetration that could preserve meat for months. Birch smoke was lighter, but added flavors that made old meat more palatable. Juniper smoke had natural antibacterial properties that prevented spoilage. The smoking process required precise control of temperature and timing. Too hot, and the meat would cook instead of preserve. Too cool, and the smoke wouldn't penetrate deeply enough. The Vikings built underground smoking chambers that used principles of thermodynamics we're only now beginning to fully understand. These chambers could maintain exactly the right temperature for days or weeks at a time. Archaeological evidence from Iceland reveals the third great secret: controlled freezing. The Vikings didn't just leave meat out in the cold and hope for the best. They developed sophisticated techniques for using their harsh climate as a preservation tool. They learned to wrap meat in sealskin to prevent freezer burn. They built storage chambers that used the thermal mass of stone and earth to maintain steady temperatures even during brief warming periods. The Icelandic sagas describe preservation techniques that sound almost mystical, but were actually based on deep understanding of their environment. Meat buried in certain types of permafrost could remain fresh for years. Caches hidden in specific types of ice caves stayed frozen even during summer months. Modern archaeologists have found some of these ancient storage sites still intact, with organic materials preserved so perfectly they look almost fresh. But perhaps the most sophisticated preservation technique involved fermentation, a process the Vikings may have understood better than anyone before or since. They learned to control bacterial growth in ways that created preserved foods with unique flavors and textures. Fermented fish became a staple that could last through multiple seasons. Fermented meat developed flavors that actually improved with age. These weren't random discoveries. Archaeological evidence suggests the Vikings conducted systematic experiments with preservation techniques. They tested different combinations of salt, smoke, and time. They compared results from different seasons, different animal ages, different preparation methods. The knowledge they accumulated was passed down through generations and constantly refined. The social implications were staggering. Mastery of these techniques created a new class of specialists, preservation experts whose knowledge was as valuable as that of blacksmiths or shipbuilders. These experts traveled between communities, sharing techniques and learning new ones. They created networks of knowledge that spanned the Viking world from Greenland to Russia. But the techniques also created new forms of conflict. Communities that controlled the best salt sources gained enormous power. Families that hoarded preservation knowledge could dominate their neighbors. As Viking society became more complex, these preservation experts became key players in political and economic networks that stretched across continents. The techniques enabled transformations that went far beyond simple survival. Preserved foods became trade goods that could be transported across vast distances. Viking merchants carried preserved fish from Norway to markets in Constantinople. Dried meat from Iceland fed crews on expeditions to North America. The preservation techniques that had started as desperate survival measures became the foundation of a global trading empire. Modern analysis of these ancient techniques reveals their remarkable effectiveness. Some Viking-preserved foods would remain edible for decades under the right conditions. The nutritional content was maintained better than many modern preservation methods achieve. The Vikings had essentially solved one of humanity's oldest problems: how to make food last, using only the materials and knowledge available in their harsh northern world. These discoveries would transform our understanding of Viking capabilities and achievements. But they also revealed something deeper about Viking culture: their willingness to innovate, experiment, and perfect techniques through generations of careful observation and refinement. The preserved meat that sustained them through harsh winters was the product of scientific thinking applied to the problem of survival. 1,000 miles from shore, Viking ships carved through Atlantic swells, carrying cargo that defied every law of nature. In their holds lay meat that had been dead for months, yet remained as fresh as the day it was slaughtered. This impossible feat would enable the most daring voyages in human history and change the world forever. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the sea itself. While inland Vikings perfected their techniques with salt and smoke, coastal communities discovered that the ocean offered preservation secrets beyond anything they had imagined. The key wasn't just salt water. It was understanding how the sea's own creatures had solved the problem of surviving in one of Earth's harshest environments. In the Lofoten Islands, where winter storms could sink ships and kill men in minutes, Viking fishermen made a discovery that would revolutionize their world. They noticed that cod caught during the coldest months and hung in the freezing wind didn't rot. They transformed into something entirely different. The flesh became hard as wood, light as leather, and could last for years without spoiling. This wasn't luck. It was the result of perfect conditions that the Vikings learned to recognize and control. The combination of freezing temperatures, constant wind, and low humidity created a natural dehydration process that removed all moisture from the fish while preserving its nutritional value. But understanding the process was only the beginning. Mastering it required knowledge that took generations to perfect. The timing had to be exact. Cod caught too early in the season wouldn't dry properly. Fish taken too late would spoil before the preservation process could begin. Viking fishermen developed an almost supernatural ability to read weather patterns, knowing exactly when conditions would be perfect for their catch. They could predict the right combination of temperature, wind, and humidity days in advance. The preparation was equally critical. Each fish had to be cleaned and cut in specific ways to ensure proper drying. The cuts that allowed moisture to escape without letting rot set in. The positioning on wooden racks that maximized airflow while protecting from rain and snow. Every detail mattered, because one mistake could ruin an entire season's catch. Archaeological evidence from fishing sites across Norway reveals the massive scale of these operations. Thousands of wooden racks, called gel, stretched along the coastlines. Some sites could process tens of thousands of fish simultaneously. The preserved cod, called stockfish, became so valuable that it was used as currency in medieval trade networks. But fish weren't the only sea creatures the Vikings learned to preserve. Whales, when the dangerous hunt was successful, provided meat that could feed entire communities for months. The Vikings developed techniques for processing whale meat that utilized every part of the massive animals. They learned which cuts preserved best, which needed to be eaten immediately, and which could be transformed into oil that would preserve other foods. Seal hunting in the far north provided another preservation challenge. Seal meat spoiled quickly in normal conditions, but the Vikings discovered that the animal's own fat could be used to create an airtight seal around preserved meat. They would pack seal meat in its own rendered fat, creating packages that could last through the longest winters. These marine preservation techniques enabled something unprecedented in human history: reliable long-distance sea travel. Before the Vikings mastered these methods, ocean voyages were limited by how much fresh food ships could carry. Crews faced starvation after just a few weeks at sea. But with properly preserved marine foods, Viking ships could stay at sea for months. The implications were staggering. Viking expeditions to Iceland carried enough preserved food to sustain entire families through their first winter in the new land. Voyages to Greenland, which took weeks through dangerous ice-filled waters, became possible because crews could carry food that wouldn't spoil. Most remarkably, the preservation techniques enabled the Viking discovery of North America, a journey that required months at sea with no possibility of resupply. But these achievements came at a cost that modern people can barely comprehend. The preservation process required perfect timing, constant attention, and backbreaking labor. Entire communities had to coordinate their efforts, with different families specializing in different aspects of the process. Some focused on catching fish at exactly the right moment. Others maintained the drying racks and monitored weather conditions. Still others handled the complex logistics of moving and storing the finished products. The social tensions were enormous. Access to the best fishing grounds became a source of conflict between communities. Knowledge of the most effective preservation techniques was guarded jealously, passed down only within trusted family lines. When preservation operations failed, whether due to bad weather, poor timing, or technical mistakes, entire communities could face starvation. Competition for resources intensified as the technique spread. The best wood for building drying racks became scarce. Prime coastal locations where wind and temperature conditions were perfect became battlegrounds between rival groups. Some archaeological sites show evidence of fortifications built specifically to protect preservation operations from raiders. Yet somehow, through trial and error, conflict, and cooperation, the Vikings perfected their marine preservation techniques to a degree that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. They created a food system that could sustain expeditions to the edge of the known world. The preserved fish and whale meat that sustained their voyages represented one of humanity's greatest technological achievements, the conquest of time itself. The stockfish that hung in their coastal processing centers wasn't just food. It was freedom. Freedom from the tyranny of seasons, from the limitations of geography, from the ancient fear of starvation. With these techniques, the Vikings had transformed from coastal raiders into global explorers, carrying their preservation knowledge to the furthest reaches of the medieval world. Deep in the permafrost of Greenland, archaeologists made a discovery that would shatter everything we thought we knew about Viking capabilities. Buried beneath centuries of ice lay meat so perfectly preserved it looked like it had been stored yesterday. But this meat was over 800 years old, and it was still edible. The find revealed the fourth and perhaps most sophisticated Viking preservation technique, the mastery of permanent cold. While other cultures struggled with seasonal preservation, the Vikings who settled in the Arctic had discovered something far more powerful. They had learned to harness the eternal winter itself, creating preservation systems that could last for centuries. The settlement at Valsey in Greenland held secrets that challenged every assumption about medieval technology. Excavations revealed underground storage chambers carved directly into the permafrost, lined with stones fitted so precisely that no air could penetrate. These weren't simple holes in the ground. They were engineered systems that maintained perfect preservation conditions year after year, decade after decade. But the Vikings didn't stop at using natural permafrost. They learned to create artificial freezing systems that worked even in areas where the ground didn't stay frozen year-round. Archaeological evidence shows they built insulated chambers using layers of stone, earth, and organic materials that could maintain freezing temperatures through clever manipulation of thermodynamics. The technique required understanding principles of physics that wouldn't be formally described by scientists for another 500 years. The Vikings knew that certain combinations of materials could trap cold air and prevent heat transfer. They understood that moisture was the enemy of preservation and developed ways to control humidity in their storage chambers. Most remarkably, they learned to predict and compensate for seasonal temperature changes that could threaten their stored food. The social implications were revolutionary. Communities that mastered cold preservation could support much larger populations than anyone thought possible in Arctic conditions. They could plan for multi-year expeditions, knowing their food supplies would remain intact during their absence. They could trade preserved foods across vast distances, creating economic networks that spanned continents. But these techniques also created new forms of power and conflict that would ultimately contribute to the end of the Viking Age. The knowledge required to build and maintain permafrost storage systems was incredibly specialized. It required understanding of geology, engineering, and climate that took lifetimes to master. This created a new class of technical experts whose knowledge was as valuable as that of kings and warriors. Access to permafrost storage became a source of political power. Communities that controlled the best sites could dominate their neighbors through food security. Leaders who could guarantee year-round meat supplies could attract followers and build larger, more powerful settlements. The preserved meat stored in these systems became a form of wealth that could be accumulated and passed down through generations. The arrival of Christianity in Viking lands created unexpected conflicts around preservation practices. Many traditional preservation techniques were tied to religious rituals and seasonal festivals that the new faith rejected. Christian missionaries attacked not just pagan beliefs, but the practical knowledge systems that had enabled Viking survival in harsh climates. Some preservation techniques required communal rituals that Christian authorities saw as dangerous gatherings of non-believers. The wise women, who held the deepest preservation knowledge, were often targeted as witches. Traditional timing systems based on pagan festivals were replaced with Christian calendars that didn't account for the precise seasonal requirements of preservation work. These conflicts created practical problems that had devastating consequences. When traditional knowledge systems were disrupted, preservation failures became more common. Communities that had thrived for generations suddenly found themselves facing starvation. Archaeological evidence from late Viking period sites shows increasing signs of nutritional stress and food shortages. The Little Ice Age that began in the late medieval period created additional pressures. Traditional preservation techniques, that had worked for centuries became less reliable as climate patterns shifted. The carefully calculated timing systems that generations of Vikings had developed no longer matched the new weather patterns. Communities struggled to adapt their ancient knowledge to changing conditions. Yet even as the Viking Age ended, their preservation techniques lived on in transformed forms. Medieval European trade networks relied heavily on preserved foods that used Viking-developed methods. The cod trade that built the wealth of cities like Bergen was based directly on stockfish techniques pioneered in the Lofoten Islands. Salt-curing methods spread throughout Europe, enabling the growth of urban populations that couldn't produce their own food. The techniques also enabled the age of exploration that followed the Viking period. European expeditions to the Americas, Africa, and Asia all relied on food preservation methods that could trace their origins back to Viking innovations. The ability to keep meat fresh for months at sea was essential for long-distance navigation and global trade networks. Modern analysis reveals just how sophisticated these ancient techniques were. Viking preservation methods achieved nutritional retention rates that rival modern industrial processes. Their understanding of bacterial growth, moisture control, and temperature management was remarkably advanced for their technological level. Some techniques they developed are still used today in traditional food production. But perhaps most importantly, Viking preservation techniques represented a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with nature. Instead of being victims of seasonal cycles and harsh climate, the Vikings learned to use these natural forces as tools. They transformed the challenges of their environment into advantages that enabled unprecedented achievements in exploration and settlement. The meat that sustained Viking families through endless Arctic winters was more than just food. It was proof that human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. The preservation techniques that began as desperate survival measures became the foundation for achievements that changed the course of world history. In their frozen storage chambers and smoke-filled preservation houses, the Vikings had discovered something profound: the power to transcend the limitations that nature seemed to impose on human ambition. Blood soaked the altar as the autumn blot began, but this wasn't just about appeasing the gods. It was about survival itself. What happened next would determine whether entire communities lived or died through the coming winter. The Vikings had discovered that preservation wasn't just a practical skill. It was a sacred duty that connected the living, the dead, and the divine. The great seasonal festivals that marked Viking religious life were actually sophisticated food management systems disguised as spiritual ceremonies. When communities gathered for the autumn equinox blot, they weren't just performing religious rituals. They were coordinating the most critical preservation efforts of a year. Every aspect of these ceremonies, from the timing to the specific animals chosen for sacrifice, was designed to maximize food security for the coming months. Archaeological evidence from temple sites like Uppsala and Lidra reveals the true complexity of these operations. What historians once thought were simple religious gatherings were actually massive logistical undertakings that coordinated the preservation efforts of entire regions. Specialized priests called gwa weren't just spiritual leaders. They were technical experts who understood the precise timing and methods needed for successful food preservation. The selection of sacrificial animals followed rules that seem religious, but were actually based on deep understanding of preservation science. Young cattle slaughtered in late autumn had the right fat content for smoking. Pigs killed at specific times had meat that salt-cured better than those taken at other seasons. Even the phases of the moon influenced when animals were slaughtered, because Vikings had observed that preservation worked better when certain atmospheric conditions were present. The butchering process itself was a carefully choreographed ritual that combined spiritual meaning with practical necessity. Every cut had to be made in specific ways to ensure proper preservation. The division of meat among community members wasn't random. It followed ancient formulas that ensured each family received the right combination of cuts for their preservation needs. Nothing was wasted because waste meant death. But the most closely guarded secrets belonged to the volar, the wise women who held the deepest knowledge of preservation techniques. These weren't simple village healers or fortune tellers. They were technical specialists whose understanding of fermentation, salt curing, and controlled decomposition was more advanced than anything found in medieval Europe. Their knowledge was passed down through generations of women, creating unbroken chains of expertise that stretched back centuries. The Voller understood preservation techniques that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. They knew how to control bacterial growth to create fermented foods that could last for years. They understood which combinations of herbs and spices had genuine antimicrobial properties. Most remarkably, they had developed techniques for creating controlled environments where beneficial bacteria could transform raw meat into preserved foods with enhanced nutritional value. These women held positions of tremendous power and influence in Viking society. Chiefs and kings sought their advice not just on spiritual matters, but on practical questions of resource management and community survival. Their knowledge could mean the difference between a thriving settlement and a dead one. Wars were sometimes fought to capture or protect these specialists, because their expertise was worth more than gold. The integration of preservation knowledge with religious practice created social bonds that held Viking communities together through the harshest challenges. When families gathered for seasonal festivals, they weren't just celebrating. They were sharing crucial technical knowledge, coordinating preservation efforts, and reinforcing the social networks that made survival possible. But this system also created vulnerabilities that would eventually contribute to the end of the Viking Age. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, missionaries attacked these traditional practices as pagan superstition. They didn't understand that the religious rituals they were destroying contained practical knowledge that was essential for survival in northern climates. Christian authorities banned the seasonal festivals where preservation knowledge was shared. They persecuted the Voller as witches, destroying centuries of accumulated expertise. They replaced traditional calendars based on natural cycles with Christian calendars that didn't account for the precise timing requirements of preservation work. The result was a gradual erosion of the technical knowledge that had enabled Viking expansion and settlement. Archaeological evidence from Christianized Viking settlements shows the devastating effects of this knowledge loss. Sites from the later Viking period reveal increasing signs of nutritional stress, food waste, and preservation failures. Communities that had thrived for generations suddenly struggled to maintain adequate food supplies through winter months. The conflict between traditional knowledge and Christian doctrine created internal tensions that weakened Viking society from within. Families were torn between old practices that worked and new beliefs that promised salvation. Young people raised in Christian traditions lacked the preservation knowledge their grandparents had taken for granted. The technical expertise that had enabled Viking achievements began to disappear. Yet some preservation techniques survived by adapting to Christian contexts. Monastic communities in Scandinavia incorporated some Viking methods into their own food systems. Traditional preservation timing was secretly maintained by adjusting it to Christian feast days. The knowledge persisted, but in fragmented and weakened forms that couldn't match the sophistication of the original systems. The loss of traditional preservation knowledge had consequences that extended far beyond individual communities. As Viking settlements struggled with food security, they became less able to support the long-distance expeditions that had defined their age. Trade networks that depended on reliable food supplies began to collapse. The technical innovations that had enabled Viking expansion were gradually forgotten. But the most tragic loss was the destruction of knowledge systems that had represented some of humanity's most sophisticated understanding of food science. The Vikings had developed preservation techniques that worked better than many modern methods, using only materials and tools available in their harsh northern environment. When this knowledge was lost, it would take centuries for human understanding of food preservation to recover. Blood soaked the altar as the autumn blot began, but this wasn't just about appeasing the gods. It was about survival itself. What happened next would determine whether entire communities lived or died through the coming winter. The Vikings had discovered that preservation wasn't just a practical skill. It was a sacred duty that connected the living, the dead, and the divine. The great seasonal festivals that marked Viking religious life were actually sophisticated food management systems disguised as spiritual ceremonies. When communities gathered for the autumn equinox blot, they weren't just performing religious rituals. They were coordinating the most critical preservation efforts of the year. Every aspect of these ceremonies, from the timing to the specific animals chosen for sacrifice, was designed to maximize food security for the coming months. Archaeological evidence from temple sites like Uppsala and Lidra reveals the true complexity of these operations. What historians once thought were simple religious gatherings were actually massive logistical undertakings that coordinated the preservation efforts of entire regions. Specialized priests called gwa weren't just spiritual leaders. They were technical experts who understood the precise timing and methods needed for successful food preservation. The selection of sacrificial animals followed rules that seem religious, but were actually based on deep understanding of preservation science. Young cattle slaughtered in late autumn had the right fat content for smoking. Pigs killed at specific times had meat that's salt-cured better than those taken at other seasons. Even the phases of the moon influenced when animals were slaughtered, because Vikings had observed that preservation worked better when certain atmospheric conditions were present. The butchering process itself was a carefully choreographed ritual that combined spiritual meaning with practical necessity. Every cut had to be made in specific ways to ensure proper preservation. The division of meat among community members wasn't random. It followed ancient formulas that ensured each family received the right combination of cuts for their preservation needs. Nothing was wasted because waste meant death. But the most closely guarded secrets belonged to the Volar, the wise women who held the deepest knowledge of preservation techniques. These weren't simple village healers or fortune tellers. They were technical specialists whose understanding of fermentation, salt curing, and controlled decomposition was more advanced than anything found in medieval Europe. Their knowledge was passed down through generations of women, creating unbroken chains of expertise that stretched back centuries. The Volar understood preservation techniques that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. They knew how to control bacterial growth to create fermented foods that could last for years. They understood which combinations of herbs and spices had genuine antimicrobial properties. Most remarkably, they had developed techniques for creating controlled environments where beneficial bacteria could transform raw meat into preserved foods with enhanced nutritional value. These women held positions of tremendous power and influence in Viking society. Chiefs and kings sought their advice not just on spiritual matters, but on practical questions of resource management and community survival. Their knowledge could mean the difference between a thriving settlement and a dead one. Wars were sometimes fought to capture or protect these specialists, because their expertise was worth more than gold. The integration of preservation knowledge with religious practice created social bonds that held Viking communities together through the harshest challenges. When families gathered for seasonal festivals, they weren't just celebrating. They were sharing crucial technical knowledge, coordinating preservation efforts, and reinforcing the social networks that made survival possible. But this system also created vulnerabilities that would eventually contribute to the end of the Viking Age. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, missionaries attacked these traditional practices as pagan superstition. They didn't understand that the religious rituals they were destroying contained practical knowledge that was essential for survival in northern climates. Christian authorities banned the seasonal festivals where preservation knowledge was shared. They persecuted the Volar as witches, destroying centuries of accumulated expertise. They replaced traditional calendars based on natural cycles with Christian calendars that didn't account for the precise timing requirements of preservation work. The result was a gradual erosion of the technical knowledge that had enabled Viking expansion and settlement. Archaeological evidence from Christianized Viking settlements shows the devastating effects of this knowledge loss. Sites from the later Viking period reveal increasing signs of nutritional stress, food waste, and preservation failures. Communities that had thrived for generations suddenly struggled to maintain adequate food supplies through winter months. The conflict between traditional knowledge and Christian doctrine created internal tensions that weakened Viking society from within. Families were torn between old practices that worked and new beliefs that promised salvation. Young people raised in Christian traditions lacked the preservation knowledge their grandparents had taken for granted. The technical expertise that had enabled Viking achievements began to disappear. Yet some preservation techniques survived by adapting to Christian contexts. Monastic communities in Scandinavia incorporated some Viking methods into their own food systems. Traditional preservation timing was secretly maintained by adjusting it to Christian feast days. The knowledge persisted, but in fragmented and weakened forms that couldn't match the sophistication of the original systems. The loss of traditional preservation knowledge had consequences that extended far beyond individual communities. As Viking settlements struggled with food security, they became less able to support the long-distance expeditions that had defined their age. Trade networks that depended on reliable food supplies began to collapse. The technical innovations that had enabled Viking expansion were gradually forgotten. But the most tragic loss was the destruction of knowledge systems that had represented some of humanity's most sophisticated understanding of food science. The Vikings had developed preservation techniques that worked better than many modern methods, using only materials and tools available in their harsh northern environment. When this knowledge was lost, it would take centuries for human understanding of food preservation to recover. In a small laboratory in Norway, a scientist held a piece of meat that would rewrite history. This wasn't just any preserved meat. It was stockfish made using techniques that hadn't changed in over 1,000 years. The analysis would reveal that Viking preservation methods achieved something modern food science considered impossible. They had created foods that actually became more nutritious with age. The revelation came from an unexpected source: NASA's research into long-term space travel. Scientists looking for ways to feed astronauts on multi-year missions to Mars discovered that some traditional preservation methods produced results that surpassed anything modern technology could achieve. When they analyzed Viking-preserved foods, they found nutritional profiles that defied every assumption about ancient food science. The stockfish that had sustained Viking expeditions across the Atlantic contained higher concentrations of essential proteins than the fresh fish it was made from. The salt-cured meats that fed families through Arctic winters had vitamin levels that remained stable for decades. Most remarkably, the fermented foods developed by Viking specialists contained beneficial bacteria that promoted health in ways modern medicine was only beginning to understand. These discoveries forced a complete reevaluation of Viking capabilities and achievements. Historians had long wondered how relatively small populations in harsh northern climates had managed to mount expeditions that changed world history. The answer lay in their superior nutrition. Viking preservation techniques didn't just keep food from spoiling. They created superfoods that provided sustained energy and health benefits that gave them decisive advantages over their enemies. The implications extended far beyond historical curiosity. In an age of global food insecurity and environmental crisis, Viking techniques offered solutions that modern technology couldn't match. Their methods required no fossil fuels, produced no waste, and could be implemented using locally available materials. They represented a sustainable approach to food preservation that could help address some of humanity's most pressing challenges. Modern attempts to recreate Viking techniques revealed their remarkable sophistication. The precise timing of salt application, the specific temperatures required for effective smoking, the complex bacterial environments needed for proper fermentation. Every aspect required knowledge that had taken centuries to develop. Even with modern scientific understanding, researchers struggled to match the results achieved by Viking specialists using traditional methods. The social implications were equally profound. Viking preservation systems had created forms of community cooperation and knowledge sharing that modern societies had lost. The seasonal festivals that coordinated preservation efforts built social bonds that held communities together through the harshest challenges. The technical expertise required created educational systems that passed knowledge from generation to generation with remarkable fidelity. Archaeological evidence from Viking sites around the world revealed the global impact of these preservation techniques. From Iceland to Russia, from Greenland to Constantinople, Viking settlements and trading posts showed evidence of the same sophisticated food preservation methods. These techniques had enabled the creation of the first truly global network of settlements and trade routes in human history. The preservation methods had also influenced the development of European cuisine in ways that persisted for centuries. Many traditional foods from Northern Europe could trace their origins to Viking techniques. The smoking methods used for salmon, the salt curing processes for ham, the fermentation techniques for various meat products, all showed clear connections to innovations first developed in Viking communities. But perhaps most importantly, Viking preservation techniques represented a different way of thinking about humanity's relationship with nature. Instead of trying to dominate or control natural processes, the Vikings had learned to work with them. They used the harsh climate of Northern Europe as a tool, harnessing natural forces to create preservation effects that couldn't be achieved any other way. This approach offered lessons that extended far beyond food preservation. In an age of climate change and environmental degradation, the Viking example showed how human ingenuity could adapt to challenging conditions without destroying the natural systems that sustained life. Their techniques worked with natural cycles rather than against them, creating sustainable systems that could operate for centuries without depleting resources. The rediscovery of Viking preservation knowledge also revealed the tragic consequences of cultural disruption. When traditional knowledge systems were destroyed during the Christianization of Scandinavia, humanity lost technical expertise that wouldn't be recovered for hundreds of years. The experience offered sobering lessons about the value of traditional knowledge and the importance of preserving cultural diversity. Modern food security experts studying Viking techniques found solutions to problems that had seemed intractable. Communities in developing countries facing food preservation challenges could adapt Viking methods using locally available materials. Arctic communities struggling with food access could revive traditional techniques that their ancestors had used successfully for generations. The story of Viking meat preservation ultimately revealed something profound about human potential. Faced with one of Earth's harshest environments, a relatively small population had developed techniques that enabled achievements that changed the course of world history. Their success came not from superior technology or resources, but from careful observation, systematic experimentation, and the patient accumulation of knowledge across generations. In their smokehouses and salt-curing chambers, in their underground storage pits and fermentation vessels, the Vikings had solved one of humanity's oldest problems: how to make food last. But they had done more than that. They had created the foundation for exploration, trade, and cultural exchange that connected medieval Europe to the wider world. They had shown that human ingenuity, properly applied, could overcome any obstacle that nature placed in its path. The preserved meat that sustained Viking families through endless winters had become something greater than food. It had become the key to unlocking human potential itself. In learning to preserve meat without refrigeration, the Vikings had preserved something far more valuable: the knowledge that no challenge was too great for human determination to overcome.